Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this session of the Risky Business Forum on Supply Chain Sustainability and Risk. Today we'll talk about the second annual State of Supply Chain Sustainability, which is a report from 2021. Today joining me, we have Dave Carrell. Dave Carrell is a research scientist and lecturer at MIT. He teaches logistics systems, the quintessential supply chain course on campus, and has taken over leadership of the State of Supply Chain Sustainability Report from Alexis Bateman and Suzanne Green. He's the MIT Freight Lab co-director, which I think we can all agree is a very important research topic these days. I'm also joined by Jim Rice, who is the deputy director at the MIT CTL, Center for Transportation and Logistics, as well as the director of the Supply Chain Exchange. Jim teaches the Supply Chain Finance Analysis class on campus, and his research focuses on supply chain resilience and supply chain innovation. His recent articles in Supply Chain Management Review were extremely informative and have informed many great conversations this fall. Gentlemen, can you take a few minutes to describe the Supply Chain Sustainability Report and also the Supply Chain Exchange?
Sure.
Dave, go ahead.
I'll go quickly on the report because I get the opportunity to share a lot of data with you over the course of this session. So thank you, Kristen, for having us, and thank you for your interest. You can think of the report as a snapshot taken annually, so a snapshot in time, where what we're trying to capture is how do supply chain professionals understand the idea of supply chain sustainability? And to be even a little more specific, what are the issues that are important to managing for supply chain sustainability? If we ask the same question year on year, we can not only see, what the hot button issues are every year, but how that changes. And the other part of it is we try to get a sense of what practices are in place every year as firms endeavor to improve their supply chain sustainability. So it's a bit of a snapshot or a benchmarking tool there too. And as you see the data on the rest of the report, we'll share what we learned by looking at 2020 data and comparing it to 2019 data as well.
Thank you. And Jim?
Yes, thanks, Kristen, for having me with you. It's exciting and love talking about resilience, and I'm glad that you've convened a group to do that. The Supply Chain Exchange is the outreach program that we have at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. It's a primary way we engage with industry, not the only way. We bring together shippers, carriers, third parties, retailers, and analyst firms to really touch on and examine and exchange information and experiences on the key issues that are affecting supply chains today and in the future. It's a source of many of our research projects, and we engage both our research affiliates as well as our students in the work that we do with our partners. So it's a live network that works really well. Be happy to have anybody who want to learn more about it engage with us. We got the best of the best, except for your company, maybe.
Thank you for that. So this morning I did the math. I met you both in 2018, which is literally just 3 years ago, but it seems like so much longer. What was common in part of a lot of the conversations, there are still some common threads, but there's so much that has changed. Back in 2018, we still had to define what supply chain was. Now, your colleagues at CTL are on MSNBC describing the bullwhip effect and why there isn't sufficient toilet paper on the shelves, or whole segments on 60 Minutes talking about supply chain and transportation. So I really appreciate your time here to talk about some of these topics that have now become more common vernacular and something that is of a concern for more and more people. So to that extent, we're seeing many more supply chain challenges are everywhere. It's bullwhip effect for multiple different types of industries, which can have a compounding effect. And there's, supply chain is no longer something that's in the background. It's definitely front page news. To that end, from what I've seen in the past, disruption can be viewed as a time-based event, something that may happen. And it seems to now have switched more to a when type event. a when type situation of, being prepared. So BCI, or Business Continuous Institute, conducts a yearly study on supply chain resilience, and I think a lot of their the statistics here have shown this in the marketplace, that it is more of a it's no longer a risk of a disruption. It's when that would be. But Jim, you've had some very interesting comments on kind of switching from that risk to really approaching it from that resilience standpoint. If you could provide some more insight into that.
Well, I appreciate your thank you, Kristen. I think that you're right. There's some recognition that disruptions are still going to occur, and we think about that when we think about the data here is just suggested companies are expecting disruptions to occur. But what's interesting is that there's a preoccupation with risk management, and I want to make a distinction between risk management and resilience action. Risk management is often oriented towards mitigating risks, meaning reducing the probability of a potential outcome. One of the issues with that is that there's no end to the sources of disruption. Yet there is a finite number of potential outcomes from a risk event, and that's what I call the 7 failure modes of supply chains. And what's interesting is that I think organizations need to, it's important to understand the risks that you're exposed to, but also very critical to say, look, we are going to experience a disruption. So when that occurs, how are we going to recreate our capabilities? And how are we going to create those 7 core capabilities? And with that, the focus goes from an infinite number of things to try to prevent to 7 core capacities that you want to recreate. And there's some known ways on how to do that, but it's a mind shift. It's a mind shift from, all right, we're gonna prevent, we're gonna sort of hunker down, to we know it's going to happen. Now we're going to reorient ourselves to be able to deal with it when it does occur, and then taking steps, either making sure that your systems are flexible or you have some redundancy that allows you to deal with the time when when the disruption may affect your supply chain, to the time when you can actually get it back up and running. So it's a mind shift that hopefully organizations can embrace. History tells us that they don't, not in large numbers. Only through the school of hard knocks do companies get some reorientation to think towards investing in resilience. And then, of course, investing in resilience has its problems in itself, because it's one of those things. If you have a successful investment in resilience, then nothing happens because you prevented a loss of a capacity. And that is using our current financial models. That's a hard thing to go to the CFO to get funding for.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. I know CTL has been looking at resiliency for many years, especially thinking about like after the tsunami that happened in Japan, and thinking, oh, well, with all these different folks who thought they had multiple suppliers, finding out that all of their suppliers were from that same area of Japan, completely shutting down the automotive production industry, really was pretty enlightening. But yet, it sounds like you would say that the industry hadn't moved too much in the direction of being more resilient and understanding your sub-tier suppliers to mitigate those types of situations.
Well, that particular disruption illustrated the importance of understanding your upstream, and meaning the suppliers of your suppliers. And so we call those to tier 1, tiers 2, tier 3s. It's hard to find out who those people are. That data is not captured in enterprise resource planning systems. That data in many cases is not available because sometimes your supplier doesn't want you to know who their suppliers are, yet they play a critical role to your ability to continue to operate. That's an ongoing challenge. I think that there's some recognition that is important, but it suffers from that same challenge of, gee, things are going well now. Why do we need to make an investment in some capacity that we may not need? And if we do, it does come to fruition that we do need it, then it's hard to show that you had a return on investment because there's no loss that you've been able to say we've eliminated the loss because the loss never occurred.
So that's a fantastic segue to kind of start talking about this State of Supply Chain Sustainability report, especially looking into the different tiers of your supply chain and really understanding what your supply chain represents and making sure you don't have forced labor or other bad practices that you don't want associated with your company. So with that, we will we'll start talking about the report. And Dave, can you provide us a little bit of a background on how many the reach of the survey and some of the key findings?
Sure. Happy to. And I'm really excited about the connections and the bridges we're building conceptually from sustainability to resilience. But just as a way for the audience of understanding the instrument that provides the data that I'll be sharing with you, the core of what you're looking at will come from a survey. We had around 2,400 people respond to this survey. We access people through our own email networks and social media networks. In fact, we'll be hitting up the people watching this to be a part of it for next year too. So we tend to get people who are engaged in discussions like this one about supply chain management and logistics and management in general. And we just ask them how they feel about supply chain sustainability, what are the issues they're managing for, and then we try to measure how those responses are changing over time.
Thank you. Yes, and that survey will be open for a few more days, so please, everybody, if you could fill that out, that would be great. So then jumping into some of the biggest findings, and perhaps to me very surprising, is that over 80% of respondents said that their commitment to ESG stayed the same or increased during a time of COVID. So people were filling out the survey of September 2020, when we still, were under some wave of COVID. What is your thought on this?
Excellent. I'm so glad that you highlighted this one. So, the first thing I think to keep in mind as you look at this sort of above the fold headline, 82% of firms were undaunted in their supply chain sustainability efforts by the COVID-19 pandemic. A few things to keep in mind. It's an entirely anonymous survey, so we never track information about which company the respondents work for or any personally identifying information. And honestly, going into it, I kind of thought, well, people might use this as an opportunity to say, I don't have time for that right now. All of us worked from home during the pandemic, faced all the personal fears that we all face trying to do the rest of our lives on top of living in a global pandemic. I really thought it would be possible that people would say, that fell off my plate this year. But the opposite was true. The way that's been interpreted as we've sort of socialized these ideas out in the world is, I would say the early adopters or the first readers of the report took this data point and said, see, that's testament to how important sustainability is. Even when times are tough, people commit to it. One interpretation. I think a second one that's come out in maybe later readers of the report has been, okay, well, who makes decisions about a firm's supply chain sustainability investments and commitments? Well, it's the leadership of the firm. They must have a sense of what they get in return for those investments, and they don't want to lose the momentum they had built up before the pandemic. In essence, we're asking them in 2020 about things, but they're thinking about 2023. So, and I don't even think those two things are really competing. I think they're both just sort of ways to understand the surprising result that the majority of people said that COVID-19 did not slow them down in this space.
Yeah, it's very interesting and encouraging.
I think so. I think the research group, as we kind of ran these numbers and started making these charts, felt the same way about it. Whatever explains it, we're still teasing all of that out precisely, but certainly the momentum does not appear to have been lost.
So let's talk a little bit about what might be behind that momentum and where the pressure was coming from for that supply chain sustainability. I was fascinated to see that, the result was that a lot of it came from the investors, and internally, a lot of it came from the executives. So I also recognize at the same time last year, so September of 2020, the World Economic Forum released a report on measuring stakeholder capitalism going towards common metrics and consistent reporting for sustainable value creation. Where the vast world of ESG reporting was kind of consolidated to a standard reporting format to go along with a 10K. Yet that report would have been way too new to influence some of these perceived, pressures. So do you have any insight or any other, elaborating information on that rising pressure for companies coming from the executives and investors?
Yeah, gosh, that's a great point. I think it ties into some of the, risk versus resilience thinking that Jim brought up to start the conversation. I guess the first thing I'd point out, sort of working left to right on this chart for the audience, is in the green bars there, you have the Likert measure of where did respondents report feeling pressure to increase supply chain sustainability. And basically everything there is between the high 2s and low 3s. So people are getting pressure from all over. What's so fascinating to me too, just like Kristen pointed out, in the blue bars there on the right, we're saying, well, how did that one change from 2019 to 2020? And that big jump in investors, I think, could have to do with some of the reporting ideas, maybe before they were codified in that report. But another thing, I think, as we looked at the data, and especially we see the rise of social issues that we'll talk about, is that, COVID-19 will be sort of, if you will, the top of the Wikipedia article about 2020, but a lot of other things were going on in the country too. I think as a nation, we were really all compelled to sort of grapple with how we really treat people from different walks of life in terms of justice and social justice and equity. And I think those headlines were on the minds of the respondents, as they were taking the survey. And I think that influences things too. On the investor side, one of the things that I think is interesting too is that, like when I first started teaching sustainability classes, maybe even 10 years ago, I think it was sometimes framed up as like, this is a play you do to sell to niche markets that will pay more for sustainably minded products. But I think as the sources of capital come into the conversation, the BlackRocks of the world who have made public announcements along these same lines, then sustainability becomes something more like a problem the world will pay you to solve if you have a good idea. And when that shift happens, I think we see a whole different set of toolboxes and a different set of talent come to the problem that I'm quite excited about.
Yeah, definitely. And so with that, I think that's a great segue into talking about what were some of the driving changes for pressure.
I think this one you really see, especially when we look at where the goals are, looking straight to the increases. So so this chart is set up the same way. The green bars are the raw data from 2020, and the blue and orange bars are the change year on year. I think people reporting that their companies seem to have more of a commitment to employee welfare and safety tracks with what was going on in the year that we asked them. I was also interested in the increase there in supplier diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll talk about that a little more too, but when we started this report, it was maybe a little bit controversial, which dimensions actually fit into sustainability. There's some people that say, it's all environmental. And then there's other people that feel equally as strongly, you have to talk about social issues if you're talking about sustainability too. And we sort of let those people fight until they used up all their energy and then just said, why don't we just ask everybody and see what the data says? And it seems to me that the data is telling us, when you ask the world of supply chain practitioners what's in their sustainability, they increasingly respond to social issues, which is a data point we're really excited to share with the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know, and there's definitely, like you said, there has been that emphasis on the E, and that rise on, focusing on the social issues. I know we probably already talked a bit about this. I also find what is interesting is, now there's also emphasis on the G, so trying to focus on the environmental, social, and governance. But it's very interesting to see, at least from my perspective, how reactive industries seem to be on what has been in the media. So thinking about how quickly your results show that DEI had an increased importance for companies was quite impressive from my perspective.
I think so, and I think it could come. This is just interpretation of the data points, and I know we're going to share the link for anyone who wants to go through the report and look at the data themselves and slice it in any way that's most helpful to them. But one of the ways that quickness that you observe, I think, could be explained is that there's the companies trying to be responsive to their customers, but I think also particularly as we think now about labor shortages and staffing and how everyone's having a hard time getting good people, there's also, I think, the management level, people trying to be responsive to make companies the kind of places where people are proud to work. And when that's part of your guiding rubric, these kind of investments make even more sense, I think.
Very well said. Good point. So kind of going slightly against that in a sense, the report showed that there is commitment, but not as much, the investment's not keeping pace with that.
You know, that's always the case. And so I think we want to be totally transparent upfront with our data, and that's what we observe. So just as you point out, when we see investment, we see that we see a strong investment. Has your company invested in supply chain sustainability? But we don't see the change being huge. And as we look, we've actually sliced this data point several different ways. We see the gap actually strongest in the issues where the growth in commitment is the highest, which is a kind of tricky way to say it. In social issues in particular, where we've seen those data points where we've said, there seems to be an increase in commitment to those efforts, the gap between commitment and investment is also the biggest. So, why is that? All sorts of interpretations are possible, but one that just, I was talking with someone the other night, someone who manages warehouses. And so the baseline of the conversation was, okay, Dave, your report convinced me that social issues are of increasing importance to sustainability efforts, but how do I make a socially sustainable warehouse? I said, as a researcher said, I don't know, but that's such a good question that I'm proud to have prompted it. So I think some of the gap there is not necessarily people want to jump to posturing or greenwashing or something nefarious. There's probably instances of that, but I think it's also just, it's hard to know how to invest in social improvements in supply chains. And that's something that we can all work on figuring out.
Yeah. And it's definitely work there. But I've been impressed with the amount of progress that's been made year over year. As a report, it's only the second report, but it's interesting to see the changes that have already occurred within that 1 year. Now, one of the areas that I am very curious about in terms of the commitment and investment, which is more recent than when this report was done, is a lot of the commitments to carbon commitments. So with COP26 just happening in Glasgow, Scotland, a few weeks ago, a lot of companies have said, like, hey, yes, we want to be carbon neutral, carbon negative, whatever that case may be. So it'll be really interesting to see what you find out in this report in terms of the commitment versus the investment.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you, and I can't wait to share the results with your team. In that, so our survey opened up in early October of this year, which is right around the time of COP26 that you're talking about, which of course that generates headlines too that are in the newspapers people read in the morning and on the radio on their commute to work. So I wonder if we will see a greater prevalence on carbon emission efforts in year 3. Won't know till we analyze the data.
Yeah, be interesting to see it happens in year 3 or year 4.
Yeah, totally.
We'll wait till next year to find out. So the other piece, looking at it, kind of slicing and dicing the data from different perspectives, looking at it more from the different industry perspectives. And I know that, across industries, like the supplier development has the highest according to the surveys, the highest adoption rate across industries, which speaks not only to the ESG perspective, but really some of the things that Jim brought up earlier in the conversation about that resiliency and understanding your suppliers and having that relationship with them. Is there more information you can share on what you found with the companies in the different industries?
I think, and I would be curious to invite Jim's thoughts in here too. In that, so one of the things that we've seen when we look at this is that the visibility and the supplier developments show up stronger across industries. And I wonder if the interpretation there is that there's some differences between sustainability efforts and maybe the risk management of sustainability efforts and the resiliency of sustainability efforts, but maybe the commonality is that challenge that Jim laid out at the beginning. There's advantage to being able to see to your second and third and fourth tier upstream supplier, but it's very challenging to do so. So I think, when we look at this and we see, in this case, the darker greens around visibility, that's people trying to do that, whether it's for sustainability or for other potential advantages too.
Jim, is there anything you would want to talk about in terms of that visibility piece?
I think that the world of visibility is the capabilities in visibility are probably advancing greatly through the importance and increased attention on sustainability. Because as we mentioned earlier, I think you might have mentioned that the importance of understanding what's going on up your upstream at the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, to understand what's really going on there. Having that visibility is really critical. And so visibility systems, they've been sort of the brass ring or the elusive capability for supply chains for a long time. I think there's some increased capabilities that are helping firms get a better understanding of their sustainability. And that actually is going to help with supply chains to be able to do better planning, to understand what their capacities are. And if you're looking at that downstream, potentially you have a better understanding of what the demands are going to be. So there's one where I think there's probably going to be a very productive spillover. I think there's a number of different tech firms that have tried to automate the supplier qualifications and assessments in contractors overseas, and they've digitized a lot of those capabilities and made them available, that visibility real time. And I think that's helped a lot. So I think that will help in terms of making supply chains certainly more effective, potentially more efficient, and potentially more resilient.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a fascinating space to see, especially as we look at all these different technologies that really do help increase that visibility.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So continuing the conversation onto, what does your firm have in place to manage that supply chain, kind of really speaks well to that visibility and that, transparency aspect of using technology to really gain insights into your supply chain and their suppliers. But obviously there's multiple different considerations that are at play and, companies reported to in the survey.
Yeah, I think we can see here, one of the things that we were interested in getting at is it's possible that, for thinking about readers of the report, they would say, okay, you've convinced me that this is interesting and maybe even important, but you haven't told me what to do yet. And so by doing a survey of practices, we can at least establish some benchmarks and baselines around what are the practices in place. And I think what's so interesting is that, if we see the most common practice, a code of conduct for the company and its suppliers, some efforts to collaborate with the suppliers, certifying the performance of suppliers, it's interesting to think how, and it really is a natural follow-on from what we were just saying, is that, those don't necessarily need to be sustainability unique efforts. Those are efforts that could pay dividends across missions.
So I just got notice that Jim has to drop. So I just want to thank Jim for your time and your insights. They're incredibly valuable, and I look forward to our continued conversations.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Sorry I can't stay further, but you're in great hands with Dave and Kristen. It's wonderful to see you again. Thanks for putting this on. Appreciate it. Bye now.
Thank you, Dave.
Of course.
Did you want to continue on, talking about some of the different components here?
Oh, sure. Just a quick note that may, anyone looking at this slide, may see, wow, that's a big red -4 next to supplier audit. I think that's just an artifact of COVID-19 in itself and people's inability to do business travel during the pandemic. So overall, I think that the take home from this slide really is that as we're looking to build sort of first base, second base, third base of supply chain sustainability practices, it really looks like, first base are things that make sense across a variety of objectives, not just sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the next year's results because, supplier code of conduct, ideally, a lot of companies already have that in play. So how do they respond with that? Because if it's already in play and there's certain things you can almost take for granted, when you approach your supply chain.
That's a great point, and it's something that, I hope the dynamic measurements that our report gets. So how are people's prioritizations of sustainability issues changing over time could hopefully be informative to changes to codes of conduct. As we see the different issues arise or change in importance, do we want to codify that into our code of conduct to make sure that our supply chain is compliant?
Yeah. And then from the collaboration piece, I find that really interesting because obviously the more collaboration you have, the better the situation is up and down your chain. But with COVID, it's that situation is so much more challenging. So obviously that collaboration has benefits just from your supply chain resiliency, like being able to continue to function. But then it has that continued benefit of pursuing different ESG objectives that a supplier might not be able to do on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real rich sort of green field of opportunity there too. And, and really we were thinking about, the overlap, just like you mentioned, between, sort of other types of benefits that come from the supplier collaboration, but also, having the kind of relationship with the suppliers that as sustainability concerns change or new issues arise, to be able to work with them on it right away, not just sort of check in once a year and see if they know about it.
Yeah, very good point. We no longer operate in that kind of environment. So then integrating supply chain sustainability into the corporate sustainability efforts. So there's been multiple, so we have the respondents were at multiple different levels of that, firm supply chain sustainability effort. So one of the things that I am very proud, I'm very proud of KPMG for many different things, very proud to be part of this team. But we've gone out and made an announcement or investment in sustainability and saying that, ESG is something that kind of is the watermark across KPMG. And so in my mind, sustainability is not something that is standalone. It's not something that's separate. I think of supply chain and, I think of supply chain sustainability as one and the same. And I think about it like across a business, being able to pull in sustainability into your decision. So I'm very interested to see, we have different levels of engagement with supply chain sustainability efforts. Do you see that it's going to become something that's more across the whole firm and that more people feel responsible for their supply chain sustainability efforts across their supply chain team?
Yeah, that's a great observation and one that I'm glad you all pulled out here. We see it here in this data, particularly. I'd invite the audience to look at that indirectly category, with the big increase from 2019 to 2020 of 40 to 44%. One way to look at that is more people see, part of my job is now not just, for example, delivering on cost or delivering on supplier performance or whatever the key performance indicators have historically been. A way to interpret this result is to say, I still have my previous position, but now I'm also thinking about sustainability in the management decisions I make. And so that kind of integration, I think, is it's different than it was in the past. It means that people that have authority and perhaps budget to make decisions are now part of making decisions that directly impact sustainability, which is a really exciting change that I'm glad we were able to track here.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and especially pulling in some of that sustainability piece into those decisions. One of the things when you have the supplier scorecards, pulling in some of their ESG footprints for whatever part is most important, whether that's carbon emissions, water usage, DEI, whatever factor, like pulling that into that decision piece. So I'd be kind of curious to see how people are interpreting that. Is if you're using that in your scorecard, are you saying you're directly involved in your supply chain sustainability, or does that still seem like it's on the indirect aspect?
Oh gosh, yeah, good point. And I was thinking, and I know since you took all of our classes here, you will have experienced this. Anytime we're in, just mathematically speaking, anytime we're trying to optimize something, if we add constraints, we're not going to get a better answer. It's going to be harder to solve and perhaps a worse answer, judged just by the objective function of the mathematical model. So anyway, that was sort of a wonky way to say there can be much encouragement to thinking that people are now incorporating sustainability into their measurement of suppliers. But I think we also have to be realistic that it kind of makes their job harder. Maybe it makes it more fulfilling, or they feel better about their job, but it adds a new thing to process when making decisions, which can be a measure of making things harder. And so it's kind of up to us and people who are interested in contributing to this field to come up with the tools and the techniques and the resources that people need to handle these more complex decision making.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, and almost takes me back a little bit about adding the constraints, and you're not going to have as good of a result. But then I think about it, if your goals and objectives are, say, reducing cost, but then your company has gone out and said we're going to reduce our carbon footprint, you can't achieve both goals at the same time unless you find some sort of medium between those two. So I would hope that, by integrating some of the different requirements that are your corporate goals, for cost savings, for example, and then also sustainability, they're able to better achieve your company's overall goals. Instead of, I look at it as two different finish lines and zigzagging between them. Well, you're not going to get there very, very efficiently.
Oh yeah, totally. It's a local optima versus global optima question. I think you're right that going towards the global optimum, I think would be at the highest level of management their objective. The other thing that your comment made me think of was, just coming from where we're coming from, we're going to beat the mathematical analogies pretty hard. But what I would maybe take off of it, though, is that assumes perfect knowledge. And I suppose there's also possibly the case where maybe in doing the due diligence around sustainability, you find new suppliers or you find out new insights about your existing supply base that wouldn't have been discovered without doing that kind of investigation. And that may lead you to, perhaps a better solution just by having done that extra chapter of due diligence on the supply base.
Yeah, you do also bring up a great point, is there's so much information that's out there now. You can't use some of the old methodologies to be able to, achieve your goals. You need that technology support to be able to pull all that information together and make sure it's also current, because that is so much work that you just described. But things can still change. So, try to make it a little bit easier to be able to always use those resources that you've spent so much time getting that information from the beginning.
Yeah. And there's, entrepreneurial activity in that space for sure. Trying to help people understand the sustainability profile of their suppliers is, like you say, it's an information overload, and so there's people sifting that and preparing that.
And that can be, for any number of, tier 1 suppliers in a company. Well, I really appreciate your time today. It's been very, very informative as always. I think the report is really great, and, has done a really good job kind of crystallizing where we are and where we're going, and seeing that, these different initiatives companies are continuing to push forward even during this, time of a pandemic. What I find very interesting is that the pressure to pursue the sustainable supply chains, grew most from the investors and the industry associations. It's been interesting to see, who's driving a lot of these this shift, and it's not based on some regulations, although there are more ESG regulations coming out there, but it's really kind of internally grown within each industry. And with the executives within the companies really being the driver for this supply chain sustainability objectives. Is there anything you kind of anticipate over the, any hypothesis you may have going in? And I know this is probably not how you're supposed to go about, this research with the report.
We've already mentioned a few things that I'm very excited about year 3, seeing how current events or news events, may change results. I think we'll know if the trajectory of the higher prioritization of social dimensions is that something that's just on its way up forever, or is that an artifact of last year? We won't know until we take a third measurement. And the other thing I'm really excited about year 3, and I can't wait to parse these results with the KPMG team and with you and with all the companies that we work with, is for the first time in year 3, we've released the survey in 3 different languages. So, we'll share the link with you again, but, it's also available in Spanish and in Chinese. And what that does that I'm so excited about is, if you take my argument that maybe sustainability is a dynamic notion, one that changes over time, you could take that as an argument that sustainability in some ways is a product of the culture that the respondent is in. And how do we get culture? Mm-hmm. It's where we are in place and where we are in time. So I'm so excited that we're going to be able to look at how do these prioritizations change, when we look specifically at people who filled out the survey in Spanish in Mexico or in Colombia or in Brazil or in China. I think that I've learned so much just by doing the translation with our translation teams. I can't wait to parse the data and see what we learn about the world that way.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I was very excited when you mentioned that it was being translated into different languages, because I think that is really important. So often we have this U.S. focus, but it's a global supply chain. Nothing is, very few things are truly local these days. So I'm very, very interested to see the results of that.
It's been such a fascinating exercise, to your point exactly about the global supply chain, like just thinking about how are we going to translate the word diversity across, from Spanish to Chinese. And so, for example, with the Spanish team, a 3-person team from Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. And so we were working on that piece of the translation, and then it came out to, we're trying to improve access to underrepresented communities. Well, then that begs the question, which communities are underrepresented in your country? And it's not the same everywhere. Everywhere has its own rich and unique history. And I learned so much just by doing the translation, asking people in the world what's going on where they are. I'm very excited to share it. Similarly with the Chinese translation, we had the issue of the word commitment. So, you saw in many of our data points, we asked about people's commitment. And the Chinese translation team initially said, so commitment says you say you're going to do something and then you do it, right? I said, well, no, you could say you're going to do it and not do it. And they said, okay, so you say you're going to do it and not do it. I said, no. and just that concept was a discussion point was so revealing to me about things about the culture that I didn't even yet know how to start appreciating.
Yeah, very good points. And sounds like you had lots of very interesting conversations.
We did. We can't wait to share them.
I look forward to hearing about them. So one of this kind of touches on, what we talked about a little bit earlier. So the fact that COVID-19 did not have an impact. And one of the hypotheses that I've had is that, it goes down to the visibility aspect. So, and I know we don't really have evidence of this, but if you've gone in and invested in your ESG footprint and really understanding your suppliers and creating that visibility, theoretically, that should have helped drive greater resilience to the COVID pandemic, because you have a better understanding of where your suppliers are and are better able to anticipate potential problems. So if a key factory that you have is going through a COVID wave, you can anticipate that there's going to be less workers who are available. There could be some transportation challenges. So I'm very intrigued by, from that process, and if there's anything you're going to get from this next survey that will help provide a little bit more support for that hypothesis.
Yeah, gosh, that's a great way to frame it, and it's hard to say. I think we will. It's also a different relationship to COVID now as the survey is open than it was a year ago. We're obviously not through it, but I think production facilities have found ways to function. Many of us, like you and I right now, are back to operating at full speed, allegedly. And so I think there'll be a little bit of a change in, are firms better prepared for pandemic? And also, is this a different pandemic, even though it's borne by the same disease, sort of a different pandemic experience for the business world in 2021 compared to 2020?
And of course, some of the downstream impacts that we've had as we've been living in this pandemic for a while, like, some of our transportation challenges, which I'm sure you talk about often with your Freight Lab group.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a great point too, to think I hadn't thought about those experiences influencing people's responses to this survey, but how could they not? It's top of the fold, front page news. It's interesting to see. I think that will, and this is not to get too far off topic, but change people's relationship to inventory and those kind of questions. It could show up in our results too.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see that. The other piece I'm very interested to see is the outside scrutiny from stakeholders and how that influences folks' commitments, because we've seen a lot of commitments over this past year, especially with science-based targets, and really looking at a more strategic carbon reduction initiatives within each company. But the targets are very bold, and how companies are going to get there, I find it's going to be very interesting to see, and when we're really going to be able to move the needle, because it's a lot of information. With carbon, CO2 emissions, talking about scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 3 being your supply chain, it's very difficult to get all of that information. So it'd be very interesting to see what the survey brings up in terms of, what people are doing from that commitment to prove that it's not greenwashing, that they really are making improvements to be able to meet their targets and goals.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with that. And to my mind, the step out of that is, like we brought up the industry slices, so one of the fair criticisms of our report effort is you define sustainability so broadly, you don't really define it. And so what does a savvy manager do when something's ill-defined? Try to make sure that the definition is the one that's best for them. So since we haven't settled on a definition, we've not really stopped anyone from that effort. But what I think we have done is we've tried to speak at a very broad level of issues about what is important to supply chain sustainability. And then I really think it's up to industry groups to say, all right, we can take that data and we know how things are made in electronics, for example, and streamline in on practical definitions and hold each other accountable in ways that domain experts know are real, better than academic experts, or even sometimes with science-based targets projects. We do have the ability to measure carbon emission, but we also, of course, need the domain experts to know, how do those factories function? How do these things actually operate? So to my mind, that's the next step is, a report like ours paints in broad strokes what's going on in people's minds with sustainability. And then it's industry associations themselves that take that data and say, and this is how it could realistically apply, within our area of expertise.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Now I'm seeing we have an audience question on how is the backup in the ports and boats floating out at sea affecting ESG reporting?
I personally haven't seen anything to suggest that the ESG reporting itself is suffering because of it. The connection that just in my world that I've seen, though, is that, we've talked about, social issues and sort of the state of the labor force in the supply chain. I think we all want that clog to be unclogged as quickly as possible, but we need to keep in mind that doing that means that people work hours that we probably would not be proud to ask them to work. So I think I haven't seen anything that says, reporting is suffering, but I do think work-life balance for people in supply chain is suffering, trying to get it fixed.
That's a good point. Although the pandemic has probably affected work-life balance for everybody.
That's true. Well, and where it happened, I mentioned the idea about, so what is a socially sustainable warehouse? So I was working with some people on that, and working with employee data to understand how we could do task management scheduling in a way that was better for the people that work there. And in some of the conversations, it came back, there's no room for that right now. It's mandatory overtime everywhere. And, that is itself, I think, an unsustainable thing that we're all having to go through.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. And especially this time of year.
Yeah. And my other hat is studying truck drivers in their life, and certainly the same with warehouse workers and with pickers and receivers. The human efforts to get everything done that we're all taking for granted will get done by the time we need it are gigantic, and I think there's a lot of room to clean that up.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing now the impact we all have on each other, and how we all rely on each other. Things that were invisible before now really brought to the forefront.
Yeah.
So trying to wrap up some of the different conclusions here. I thought this one was very interesting, saying that it's too early to see whether supply chain sustainability will be embedded in most companies' business strategy. There are many obstacles that still need to be overcome. So I thought that was really kind of telling, especially looking at the last conclusion of, by linking sustainability efforts to corporate performance, companies are likely to benefit from a virtuous circle, and enhanced supply chain sustainability drives business improvements, which in turn encourage further measures to safeguard a healthy planet. So that almost reaches back to the earlier conversation we had with Jim. But I just wanted to get if there's any other takes you or inputs you have on that, because I do find that a very key kind of exciting aspect of the report, and interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. If I had to characterize the mindset of some of the readers of the report, it would be, that the data tells a story of a growing importance of supply chain sustainability, maybe more than the reader themselves would have guessed. But then, the next step of that is, particularly if they're a manager or someone, running a firm, they do not necessarily walk away from our report with confidence that if I invest in this sustainability effort, it will pay me back, with a return. Mm-hmm. And so I think everyone is still just sort of dipping their toe in the water, or not everyone, but many people are, because, they recognize the importance, but they're not wholly convinced of the payoff, or maybe they don't understand its terms, like how long will it take to make any kind of return on this. So I think that's what I think the mindset of our readers is. They think, all right, this data suggests that this is important to people, but it's not yet wholly convincing that when I put dollars into it, that they know what they're getting back and it's measurable.
And that's so true. And it goes back to Jim was also was talking about earlier, of if something bad happens, like bad publicity, you end up on the cover of New York Times. For example, if you find that there's something in your supply chain that you wouldn't want, like slave labor, the cost of that is astronomical to your publicity and to your company name. But if that doesn't happen, you don't put that into your valuation necessarily.
Yeah, it's It's an analogous argument to the TSA at the airport. We don't know what they stopped from happening, but we're glad they stopped it. It's a similar position.
That's a good thing to keep in mind as we all will be traveling over the holidays.
That's true. That's true.
So we have another question from the audience that I thought was really good about, will the Build Back Better plan play a big role in adding sustainability to supply chains? So I assume this kind of goes back to some of the freight conversations that we're having just a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think so. I think that parts of Build Back Better. I'm not an expert on the legislation, I guess, but I know the efforts around taking climate change more seriously as a country would certainly play a role. Sort of at the level of the individual company actor, it's hard to say. I know that's an objective, but I don't think I have any insight on particular, if it will.
So stay tuned to some of your Freight Lab coming forums.
Yeah. We're happy to talk truck drivers with anyone who wants to.
Well, thank you so much. This has been extremely informative. I really appreciate you joining us. I do want to point out we have this survey, so please go out to this link to be able to take that survey. It does close in just a few days, but I know, speaking for yourself, I'm sure the participation is really appreciated.
We would love it. Thank you for having both Jim and myself, and to anyone watching. Yep, we really want your responses, and we want your responses whether or not you work in sustainability, whether or not you believe it's important. We want to hear from everybody, and if you have people in your life who you think would be more comfortable, yourself included, answering in Spanish or in Chinese, we have that set up for you, so please share your opinions with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you.